If you had to devise a diet and lifestyle that acted in a way like a perfect storm, like if you were, for whatever demonic reason, intent on developing dementia, like how would you live and what would your diet be like?
Yeah, I would, at the risk of being hyperbolic, I would basically live like a modern American human, unfortunately. If we think about generally relatively sedentary, not necessarily getting either access to or engaging with cognitively stimulating activities that really challenge our capabilities, right? We're often very busy, right? We feel very stressed, but we're never really pushing the boundaries of our capabilities and then resting, recovering, sleeping afterwards. And, on top of that, in general, eating a hyperpalatable, calorie-dense, nutrient-poor diet. We know that excess energy availability, metabolic disease, right? Those are significant risk factors for dementia. We know we've already touched upon some of the nutrients that we know are critical, and if we're deficient in B vitamins, vitamin D, iron, omega-3s, all of those, and potentially even interact to increase dementia risk. So right now, often I think we're seeing that perfect storm to an extent. There have been some attempts to improve this. So actually, the rate of individuals with very high levels of homocysteine actually decreased in the population when they started to fortify flour with folic acid, right? Because you improved some of that B vitamin status, but in reality, everything else has really trended in the wrong direction.
Yeah, it is crazy the way the standard American, just the degree to which the standard American diet and lifestyle is ravaging our bodies, and the brain sits directly downstream of all of the consequences, all of the myriad consequences of that.
Yeah, and a lot of this is driven by overall society, right? This isn't anybody's fault necessarily. This is just where we've ended up based on. Well, some of it's basic human nature, right? It's a lot of energy and effort to move, to engage in challenging tasks, and so we've started to engineer those things out of the environment, and we're still doing it, right? So with AI, right? And again, AI could be a fantastic cognitive orthotic. It could be a way for us to challenge ourselves and extend our capabilities.
What did you just call it? A cognitive orthotic?
Orthotic, yeah. So
what do you mean? But that's a fascinating way to phrase it.
So, and this is not my own phrase. I've stolen this from somebody else. But it's basically this idea that if you think about orthoses for like physical function, you might use it in an individual who has like cerebral palsy to help kind of restructure or hold the foot in a certain way so they can walk, right? So it's supporting them to do something they couldn't do otherwise. And this could be the same thing. So there's certain evidence that if you use, say, large language models to challenge your thinking or to extend your thinking, right, in conversation, right? What have I missed? What else could I do? What else should I be? Here's my first try. How could I improve this? And that is essentially an orthotic, right? It's extending our current capabilities, but requires you to actually engage in that process. Whereas it could go the other way, where we just let it do all the thinking for us. And we know that the functions we want to keep need to be continuously challenged in order for that function to be maintained. So any critical thinking, any complex skill, if we offload that to something else, that's a skill, that's a function that we'll lose. And we do that to enough functions, and overall function will decline. So we're at a tip. People have been again, quite hyperbolic in terms of how bad it could be. And it could be very bad, but it could also be very good. It all just depends on how we end up using these tools.
What do you say to people who are convinced that dementia, Alzheimer's disease are genetic in origin, that it's something that they will inherit if, say, their parents or their, one of their parents or their grandparents had it?
There's two parts to this that I think are important to think about. So one is the absolute genetic component. So yes, a small proportion of Alzheimer's disease early onset familial Alzheimer's disease, which is a single mutation in a single gene, like amyloid precursor protein or one of the presenilin genes, which does result in a fairly predictable early onset dementia. So I know some clinicians work with populations like that and do seem to see some benefit if they can put some lifestyle things in place, but that's sort of like a small sliver, maybe 1%. The rest certainly has a genetic component. You can develop polygenic risk scores for dementia, with at least within certain populations. And then there's obviously ApoE genotype being the best known genetic risk factor. Recently, there was one paper that came out in Nature a couple of years ago that argued that ApoE4, being homozygous for ApoE4, was as bad for dementia risk as having one of those other mutations that I just mentioned. They said it behaves like that. When you look at their data, that wasn't even true. Like, you looked at the paper, and yes, obviously, if you have 2 copies of ApoE4, you have a significantly increased risk of dementia. We know that. But it didn't, like the onset and the trajectory didn't map onto those other conditions. So there were a lot of people who were really scared of that, based on that paper, because they were just like, well, if I have 2 copies, right, I'm doomed. But when you look at other data, there are several populations where being either heterozygous or homozygous, right, having 1 or 2 copies of ApoE4 doesn't increase your risk of dementia. And therefore, it seems like it must be context dependent. Like, what's the environment that gene is sitting in? Because there was one study that even looked at mortality risk, because ApoE4 also increased the risk of cardiovascular disease, looking at Sicilian American populations compared to Sicilian populations in Sicily. So they had very similar genetic background. ApoE4 was only increased risk in those who are in America. So there's this interaction with the environment. And there are several other studies that show that ApoE4 is probably a risk multiplier. So if you drink excessive alcohol, or if you have a poor quality diet, or if you're sedentary, you have other cardiovascular disease risk factors, then ApoE4 kind of magnifies that effect on dementia risk. But by the same token, if you then remove those risk factors, you exercise more, you improve omega-3 status, you decrease alcohol intake, you will see an increased benefit such that some of that outsized risk is decreased or nullified. It's difficult to say whether it's completely nullified, but certainly because it's like interacting with those environmental factors, if you address those factors, you've probably removed the majority of excess risk. Beyond then ApoE4, so you can still have dementia in your family without having ApoE4, right? And people then might think, and it's true, if you have family members who have dementia, you're more likely to get dementia, your risk is increased. But there are also studies that show, so say if it's like polygenic, right, across multiple genes, regardless of your genetics, you still benefit from lifestyle factors that are associated with dementia risk, right? So you can decrease your risk regardless of your genetics. And there's other evidence that one of the things that you don't isolate in those kinds of studies is shared lifestyle and environments, right? So you're likely to eat and sleep and exercise like your parents did. And so if you can change those shared risk factors, again, you can overcome some of that shared risk. So I think there's a huge amount, like across all the data, there's a huge amount of hope that regardless of your family history and genetics, you still have a ton of agency and ability to modify your risk.
I love that. So, I mean, put simply, genes are not destiny.
Yeah.
I've always found that to be incredibly empowering when looking at the epidemiology of ApoE4 and how, even just like location modifies risk. It's like incredible to see that, if you're genetically at risk for Alzheimer's disease here in the United States, you might simply live to a less industrialized part of the world, adopt a diet and a lifestyle that's less sedentary, less industrialized, and see that risk, significantly attenuated, if not abolished completely.
Yeah,
it's incredible.
And you could move to the other side of the world, but I mean, it's possible to do it here. Of course, like different people have different resources and time and that to do it, but the the possibility is absolutely there for everybody.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.